It is. Good morning, everyone. I'm Juliet Eilprin, the Senior National Affairs Correspondent for The Washington Post. I'm here with Lisa Jackson, who is the former administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency and currently serves as Vice President for Environment, Policy, and Social Initiatives at Apple. She is also the only cabinet member I've ever interviewed who has sung Stevie Wonder in the course of an interview, another claim to fame. And before I get started, I'd like to remind everyone in our audience and those who are watching online that you can tweet questions for Lisa using the hashtag #WorldInBalance, and I will take a few of those throughout our conversation with the help of an iPad. So with that,
very cool.
Apple has pledged to shift to 100% renewable energy, and I understand you're now at 96% for your global facilities. I was wondering if you could talk about what's been some of the hardest aspects of meeting that goal, and perhaps what's been easiest about that.
Yeah, I think the real innovation came for challenges like data centers. So Apple was the first to run a data center 100% on renewable energy. And it's kind of easy in California where we have energy choice. So you can say, I want to purchase clean energy to run my data center in California. But it's harder in states like North Carolina or Nevada where you actually have to work with the utility and the community to actually build and develop, clean energy. In those cases, it's solar power. So that was a challenge because when you think about data centers, they can never go down. So you have to think about a solution that works, that's resilient.
What have you found? What's your backstop? I mean, are there particular things?
Well, in the old days, the backstop was fuel cells. It's still there in North Carolina, as well as the fact that we're connected to the grid, partially because you have to be. You can't generate your own, so you connect to the grid and then pull back. So the grid is a great backstop for us as well. We have to work with the utilities. As we're building newer data centers, what we're finding is that, especially in parts of Europe, the transmission grid's in better shape. It's more resilient, more redundant, and so you can actually have clean energy as your primary and as your backstop.
Mm-hmm. And have you found, have there been increased costs, and how have you dealt with that, or has it ultimately been cost neutral to
No, we challenge ourselves to be cost neutral or even sometimes cheaper than what we'd estimate brown power to be. Mm-hmm. In some cases, we use PPAs, and part of the calculation around a PPA
Can you explain to our audience?
Oh, sorry. A PPA is a power purchase agreement. It's like a long-term contract. So obviously, you're looking at the long-term cost of conventional power, and you're trying to decide whether construction development of new clean power, with the incentives that come along with it, but sometimes without, depends, can actually be better for the company.
Got it. And you also, so your more recent pledge has been to construct a closed-loop supply chain where products are made only using renewable resources and recycled material. You have your little robot Liam, right,
Yes,
who is doing some of that work. Can you talk a little about how that's a slightly different task and how you're going about doing that?
Yeah. So energy. We'll come back to energy because I think it's so incredibly important. But one of the things I loved about Apple and deciding to go was that we're a product company. We make hardware, and obviously it's what people use. We touch consumers there, so there's a moment where we can really get consumers to appreciate what we stand for. But we also use a lot of material to do that. And materials are mined from the earth. I forgot there's been studies, but I think it's almost 100 different elements from the periodic table are actually in your iPhone. And so, people are starting to be concerned about that from the standpoint of what mining does to the planet, also the social implications.
Sure.
And so we run a really strong program to deal with those issues, but we thought, what if we, and I think we're the only ones in our sector thinking this way, what if we can start to think about a time when an iPhone is made from totally recycled materials or totally renewable materials, like a biomaterial. So we're starting our brilliant engineers to work on that. It's really fun. It's fun to sit around a table with folks who spend all day thinking about aluminum alloys, for example. And we've made huge progress. The iPhone 10 8, I think. No, sorry, 8, because 10 has stainless steel in it. But the aluminum that's in the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus is actually much lower carbon than aluminum before. And we did that through a combination of how the aluminum is smelted. We like to find hydropower as a source there. But also just being a lot more efficient with aluminum.
Okay.
And then I just should give a plug to our program that does work on supply chains. Just today, the Enough Project listed us as #1 for our work on cobalt sourcing around the world. Cobalt is used in batteries in our products. And Amnesty International yesterday said we were #1 in our sector for the work we're doing there as well.
And so you do a lot of travel in your job, including to China, of course, India, right, and Europe. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little about what it is like, given the new administration and the shift in positions on many of the policies that you and then your successor, Gina McCarthy, put in place. What are the kinds of discussions that you're having with leaders of other countries, and what is it like also when, in many ways they might be touting what they're doing, but we just had statistics that came out on Monday showing that carbon emissions globally are rising, and that much of that is driven by China, although, again, obviously the United States consistently comes in as #2. So could you talk about what these conversations are like, and how you navigate your role both as an American and as someone representing a major company like Apple?
Yeah, I think after the initial shock at the change in the position, I don't personally spend a lot of time talking about the policy, because I'm not a policymaker. That's not my job anymore. I certainly can't explain policies for this administration. But I do think that we spend a lot of time trying to deal with the challenges. So people will often want to understand not only our work to be 100% renewable, but also our work in our supply chain. So we've moved on to 14 of our suppliers around the world who've pledged to be 100% renewable for their work with Apple, and we'd like to get our whole supply chain there. So more we talk about the challenges. China has real challenges, but I think the difference I see in the conversations, even maybe from my days at EPA to now, so that time frame, is a lot of people cynically looked at China and thought, okay, they're just saying whatever because they want the world to, not be upset if they scuttle the Paris deal, for example. Now, when you're in China, you see it as an imperative for them. I mean, obviously they have air pollution issues, they're significant, but they also have a lot more people and a lot of densely populated cities, and they know that their populations are moving into cities. So they're really interested in clean energy, electric powered vehicles, for example, because they need to find a solution for traffic, which is causing, which is a significant part of the air pollution they have. So whether it's China, India the same way, I think what you find are people who are motivated by something other than politics because they have real world pollution issues, and they see the burning of fossil fuels is causing a lot of environmental problems, climate change being one. So when you start to address that and move to less intense carbon processes, you start to address more than one problem.
And I know that while it's true you're not in your policy position, we'll talk some policy. And one thing is that last year, Apple did join Google, Facebook, and other Silicon Valley companies, and Amazon and Microsoft as well, to sign an amicus brief in support of the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Power Plan, which right now the EPA is in the process of withdrawing. Can you talk about what is the role for these companies when it comes to national policy, particularly in this area of climate, energy, and the environment? What's your proper role, and why is it that these firms decided that they wanted to file a brief in this case?
Business needs certainty. It's funny because when I was at the EPA, that's what I heard constantly from businesses that were they were like, listen, we want to comply. We want to be on the right side of your agency. We never want to see you, but we need to understand where this is going. And so I think you find companies like ours who are saying, we've made these investments because we believe it's the right thing to do, because we also believe they're not bad for business, they're good for business, because we also know that our customers around the world, we're a multinational business, we sell around the world, expect it from us. And so what we'd like you to understand is that we'd like to continue on a trajectory that has a predictable reduction in carbon over time. We've sort of invested in a belief that the future needs to be low carbon and eventually zero carbon. And we believe, you know, as Silicon Valley, that innovation is really important in terms of getting there. And so for us at Apple, I think it was, and our CEO's been really clear about this, we need to speak up for the things we believe in, and one of the things we're pretty strong on around the world is the need to fight climate change and to use materials responsibly.
And when you make that kind of business argument, right, which essentially you're making a business and an economic argument to, for example, whether it's, you know, Republican officials here in Washington, whether it's potentially on the Hill or in the administration, or if you're having those discussions with, you know, governors or in the states where Apple's presence. I mean, is there some degree of, you know, are people receiving and hearing that and incorporating it? To what extent can that is that resonating with some of the maybe, you know, office holders that you know, that might be less inclined to immediately, you know, sign on to, you know, dramatic climate initiatives and things like that?
You know, when you're a lot of our work is at the state level in this country because you know, there isn't a major climate change bill moving forward right now in Congress, so there's nothing to work on right now. But at the state level, states have seen the economic growth potential of investing in clean energy. So, you know, recently I was in Iowa because we announced a new data center there. We're definitely not the first technology company to go there, but Iowa's, you know, made a huge bet on wind energy because they happen to be very rich in it, and it's very compatible with another huge land use they have, which is agriculture. You don't have to pick one or the other, like what you might have to do if, say, you had, you know, a lot of mining or fossil fuel exploration and development.
Got it.
And so, you know, what you find is that governors and mayors, and it's somewhat politically, it's devoid of politics in terms of red or blue, are looking at what are the opportunities for my people to get jobs in this sector. And we had the same thing in North Carolina. We, of course, run into skeptics, but our position is, look, we don't want it to cost more for your customers or ratepayers in your state. We're not asking to be subsidized by them, but we do believe that this is an opportunity for us to show you that a business like ours, one we think is very future-oriented, can run on clean energy.
Got it. And now I want to shift and talk a little bit about science and about how that, for example, plays a role in policymaking here. Obviously, you're trained as a chemical engineer and worked for EPA as a career employee before heading the agency. And a lot of what, of course, my colleagues and I spend our time writing about is how science is being done at the agency right now and other agencies that, you know, we certainly are both seeing a questioning of the agency's own science by Scott Pruitt and others, who argue that it's led to predetermined outcomes. We've seen an overhaul of these outside advisory boards. There are 22 of them total, where they're saying that any scientist who has received an EPA grant should either choose between getting funding from the agency or helping guide its science. Could you talk a little about how you see science being done at EPA, both in the past and now, and what is the interplay between how research and findings are made at EPA and how that leads to a policy outcome? Since there's been a lot of it.
Pretty much everything EPA does is subject to lawsuit. And it doesn't matter who does it. It's not me, it's not the current administration. And so the really important underpinnings of defending those lawsuits are science. The other thing I say, I am a chemical engineer by training. I have a master's in it, chemie. I often say to folks, people ask me all the time, I really care about the environment, what should I major in? And I say, if you can, you know, engineering, if not, environmental science, but make sure if you have the interest in science that you try to put that forward, because people assume, I think because the environment is, you know, trees and nature must be simple, but it's actually very complex. You know, air modeling, you know, we used to make jokes about the folks at at EPA who do air modeling. But they're incredibly smart mathematicians.
Were you arguing they were geekier than other EPA employees? Was that the subject?
I'm not saying.
Okay, not saying.
But they have to be. They have to be incredibly good mathematicians because they're trying to predict what will happen around the world if you're talking about climate change or locally with pollution. And nobody wants dirtier air for their family. Nobody wants dirtier water. Nobody wants to live in a place that's fouled by activity, development, or otherwise. And so, you know, I think that the payoff, if you will, for science is that you win more cases than you lose. I don't think you can decree science. And I also think that it is incredibly important to understand the motivations of people who are doing the science. So while I happen to know a lot of the scientists, or did know them when I was head of the EPA, it was not unusual that scientists who were doing work funded by EPA came to very different conclusions and then had huge arguments about what the preponderance of evidence said. And that is, you know, that is what the scientific process is. It's exactly that. And so I don't think you can use fiats to dictate that process, and I don't think you should.
And in terms of the input that, again, someone running the EPA should get from those on the outside, again, as someone who's both been on the inside and then has been, not that you're holding regular meetings with the EPA, but obviously I'm sure there are folks from Apple who meet with them. Could you talk a little about that? Because, you know, we now look at the schedules of cabinet members as we have in the past, and clearly, you know, there are patterns that have emerged, you know, whether you're talking about, again, the Environmental Protection Agency or the Interior Department, where, you know, part of clearly the message we've gotten from the Trump administration and from top of political appointees is they feel like the regulator community just didn't have as much access to the leadership of these agencies under the Obama administration. Now they're certainly making a huge effort to incorporate both their views and simply just sit down and talk with them, go to their board meetings. I'm just curious of, you know, again, what was your approach to meeting folks in the past, and how do you think you strike a balance between getting the input from, say, the constituencies that an agency is regulating and the constituencies who are affected by some of the policies, but might not be the actual folks who are being regulated by an individual agency?
You have to hear from all sides. And, you know, I prided myself on hearing from all sides, and I heard it from all sides. You know, and it wasn't unusual that everyone from the strong environmentalists to the proponents from some sector of industry would say you got it 100% wrong. And some people are nice about it, and some people are darn rude about it. But that's the job. You know, I started at EPA, and 20 years before I became, almost 20 years before I became the administrator of the agency. And it is public service. It is public service, and I cut my teeth at Superfund sites where people would walk up to you in tears because their child was sick and they were afraid it was something they had done or some negligence on their part because they gave them a bottle made with contaminated water. So, you know, the only other thing I'll say is that the rulemaking process is transparent for a reason. Every rule is supposed to be put out. It's supposed to be put out for public comment, and then it's adopted, and then it's usually litigated depending on the outcome of the rulemaking, one way or the other. Industry and groups that, you know, sort of live in this Washington bubble, they always have a voice. They have lawyers and trade associations that comment on rules all the time. The important thing is that the American people, sort of this body of people, believe that the Environmental Protection Agency is there as their advocate for clean and healthy communities. And you can argue where that line needs to be, but that's the role of the Environmental Protection Agency and certainly its leader.
Got it. We have a question from on Twitter from Zane. What are your thoughts on the term greenwashing? Is it a legitimate critique of global tech firms' corporate social responsibility commitments? To what extent do you think greenwashing exists and that's an issue?
I think it's a great sounding name. I think it's cynical to some degree. I think the problem, though, and I've always thought this, is that the average consumer doesn't really have a way to understand who's really doing something that's meaningful and who talks a lot about it.
Right.
And so at Apple, we try really hard not to put out a press release every day saying, look at all the great things we're doing, but we do try to do them and then talk about them later. Actually, the one thing we're doing that's not like that is this whole circular economy with the robot and taking phones apart and trying to recycle. So I think I can understand why you might be a bit cynical, Zane, which is, are you really doing it?
And don't you think to some extent isn't that an accurate description of what some companies do?
Absolutely. I mean, you can think of companies right now whose commercials are all sunshine and tweeting birds, but maybe not so much. And so I invite, folks to go on our website, apple.com/environment. You can read our annual report. You can read our supplier responsibility report. You can read a report for every product we make, and you can see why I say that the carbon used for iPhone 8 aluminum is much less than iPhone 7 and iPhone 6. You can see all those numbers. That's all. That's the best we can do, I think, but I think it's really important to do.
Excellent. And so we also have another question which said, beyond Apple's direct efforts on sustainability, can you expand on the role of your supply chain in achieving climate goals? And I think, again, people often like to hear the specifics. Can you show how you're working with suppliers to achieve what you're doing? And it's given the fact that Apple has such an extensive network of suppliers.
Yeah, so 77% of our carbon footprint of last year's carbon footprint, we haven't done it for this year, is in our supply chain. So that means, think about it, these are places that manufacture, they may be mines, they may be a component manufacturer, they may do something.
And what's the breakdown? Could you say what, and I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, what breakdown is domestic and what breakdown is overseas?
Most of the carbon emissions are overseas, but we definitely have in our top 200 suppliers, I can't remember the number right here sitting, but we have a huge part of our supply chain.
It's domestic.
Our component manufacturers, like the cover glass is the one I like to use with Corning.
Sure.
So you were saying, so 77% in the supply chain. So now you have to get that supply chain to move to clean energy. Right. Some people would say, well, if they don't use clean energy, take them out of your supply chain. There's two problems with that. No one's using it yet, and so you have no supply chain. That's a problem. But more importantly, if Apple stands for anything, it should be moving the supply chain leadership. And so what we find is a lot of what the supply chain energy managers need is help. They're just not, they don't have a staff of engineers and an energy department like Apple does and consultants who can help them find deals. So our program consists of two things, mainly technical support and a web portal where our teams go out and spend tons of time with suppliers trying to help them move to clean energy. To be honest, most of our suppliers in the US don't need the help. We're talking about certainly Asia, but other suppliers around the world who need to understand, how do I access clean energy in my country? I can't just plug in to a clean grid.
Right.
And then we also have done...
are there stories that come to mind of here in whether it's Asia or Africa or Europe that where you were able to connect a supplier and what does that look like?
It looks like wanting to give all the credit to them because you want that moment when sort of they get the trophy. But yeah, we have several suppliers in China who we've scouted the deals and helped them understand and said, here's the investment you would have to make. Here's us assuring you that the energy will actually make it onto the grid so that it's offsetting the energy you're pulling from the grid. And we also did 485 megawatts of clean energy ourselves in China as a down payment for our supply chain, so that they
And was that solar, or what kind of energy was
Yeah, solar. Actually, we have one wind deal, two as well. So solar and wind. But the idea is a little bit of do it, show somebody, teach somebody how to fish, and then at some point say, hey, we're actually going to start favoring suppliers whose carbon footprints are lower. That'll be one of the ways we evaluate you. We're not doing it yet because we want to help you get there, but the time is coming.
And do you have a year where you're hoping to achieve 100% renewable with suppliers, or is that not fixed in stone?
Yeah, we haven't announced a year for that. We announced 4 gigawatts of new clean energy in our supply chain by 2020. We did that 2 years ago, and we already have 2.8 gigawatts under contract and don't quite quote me on the number, but over 1.5 already built. So we have a couple more years, but of course we want to finish early. And so that 4 gigawatts will be a significant step in the right direction.
Got it. And you also have, well, obviously we're mainly talking about the environment in this context. You have social initiatives as part of your portfolio as well. And I'm wondering if you could talk about a little bit about that, and again, what is the role of, again, a company like Apple when it comes to social policy and having an impact on these issues, whether it's connecting low-income communities with technology or other things. What is the role that you think that Apple aspires to play, and how do you execute that?
I was really drawn to Apple because of our CEO, Tim Cook, and Tim says that companies should have values. Companies are made of people, and they should stand for something in the world. So forever, I think Apple stands for making products that are amazing, the best products in the world. They work well, and they're empowering products. They connect you, they enable you, you get the product and you decide what to do with it. But he's been really very vocal about saying, but we also stand for fighting climate change and living up to and being an environmental leader. We also stand for education. And that's mainly because our products are often used in education, but because our roots were the idea that a product like a computer, a Mac, could change somebody's outcome and really give them the power to learn and really move forward. We also stand for accessibility, meaning our products, when you think of them, most of them are smooth sheets of glass.
Right.
Think about someone who's blind or someone who has other motor skill issues, and they're thinking, how does that work for me? And so 1 in 7 people on the planet have a disability, and if you don't have one now, you'll probably get one as you age. And so our products have software that's built in and are widely seen as the most advanced in the world from the standpoint of people with disabilities, blind, deaf, motor disabilities, but also developmental or learning disabilities. Really, really proud of that as well.
And we're clearly at a moment, and this is in Washington and in Silicon Valley and Hollywood and elsewhere, where the issue of women in the workforce, in terms of whether it's sexual harassment, opportunity, is coming up, and the kind of the tenor of the conversation has changed in recent weeks. And I'm curious, again, Silicon Valley has repeatedly come up as one of these communities that broadly is progressive, but there have been real challenges for women getting ahead. Could you just in closing, talk just a little about how Apple's tackling that, or what does that conversation look like?
Yeah, Tim's been clear, that he thinks women are the future of Apple, because we need the diversity of approaches that happen when your workforce reflects the world. It's racial diversity, it's gender diversity. And we're really proud of the fact that if you look at sort of the folks we're hiring in, much more diverse than folks who have been at Apple for a long time.
But I imagine on the senior level, it's still significantly.
Yeah, although if you take a look at our senior leadership page, we just hired a new general counsel, Kate Adams, the new head of people, a woman. So a new head of managing director for China, a woman engineer. So I think Tim is personally committed to leading by example, and I think we're going to continue to do that, but also to do it in a way that values the employees we have. So, there is no moment when you suddenly wake up and it's just ta-da, it has happened. You have to respect the fact that the company, which has a really strong culture, is going to change over time.
Great. Well, Lisa, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining us. And now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Stephen Stromberg, to the stage for our next conversation. Thanks.